This week on the Changelog, we're talking to Jonathan Carter, who's on his fourth term as Debian Project Lead, DPL, and we're talking about 30 years of Debian. We talked to Jonathan about what it takes to create and lead this massively popular free Linux distro, his path to Debian as a contributor, and now as DPL. What exactly is a Linux distro and what's involved? How products like Proxmox have total freedom to build on top of Debian, and that's by design. And we even get into the state of the enterprise Linux standard. Jonathan has opinions. Oh, and for our Plus members, there is a bonus 12 minutes to enjoy, so stick around for that. For those who are not Plus members yet, check it out at changelog.com/plus+. $10 a month, $100 a year. Directly support us, drop the ads, and we give you bonus content like today. A massive thank you to our friends and our partners at Fastly and Fly. This podcast got you fast all over the world because Fastly, they're fast globally. Check them out at fastly.com. And our good friends over at Fly help us put our app in our database close to you, wherever you are in the world with no ops. And they'll do it for you too. Check them out at fly.io. I'm here with Lazar Nikolov, developer advocate at Sentry. Okay, let's talk about your live streams. You're constantly building something and live streaming it. Give us a peek behind the curtain. What do you do in your live streams? What can we expect if we watch?
Yeah, so at Sentry, that's even how I started. I started to build a mobile application for tracking expenses in 4 different frameworks because I wanted to, explore basically the DX of the 4 most popular frameworks: Swift UI, Jetpack Compose, React Native, and Flutter. Then I moved on during October. Of course, we did the Oktoberfest where we tried to fix a bug in the React Native SDK. That was pretty cool. And what else? For example, right now I'm streaming and I'm usually streaming on YouTube. I started building a really cool project that I want to call the Errorpedia. So it's like a Wikipedia of errors. So my idea was to just build a website that enumerates famous frameworks, like used frameworks, and what errors can be encountered within those frameworks, with a little bit of explanation why they happen and also how to fix them. I had an interesting choice of technology, so like Astra for the whole website, because of its ability to embed React components or Vue components or solid Svelte components. And these are frameworks that I want to cover the errors from. So like the whole website, the whole doc site would be just Astra and Markdown. But when the interactive example needs to happen, I'm just going to export that from a package in the monorepo. So that was interesting. And I started building that, and it put me into this mode of thinking about errors. And I was like, okay, we can do these errors and we can do these errors. I started to compile a list of errors that we can document. And I started thinking about, what about errors that don't necessarily break the page?
Yeah.
I mean, they break the page, but they don't produce errors in the console, right? There could be responsiveness errors, right? Like mobile or tablet, something like that. Something gets pushed off the screen. There's like an overflow hidden on the body. You can't really access that, So it breaks the flow, the operation flow for the user, but it doesn't produce anything in the logs, right? Maybe we're talking about, I don't know, Firefox or Safari CSS issues, because we know, especially Safari, when you're building something for Safari, those who do front end, things usually break, but they don't produce an error. So I was thinking about that, and I was like, okay, we have all the tools in Sentry. So yeah, that's what I'm doing right now. I'm streaming building that widget that lets you, start the recording and send it to Sentry.
Okay, if you want to follow along with Lazar, you can follow him at youtube.com/NikolovLazar. We'll put the link in the show notes, but it is youtube.com/NikolovLazar. Lots of cool live streams, lots of cool videos. Check them out. Again, the link is in the show notes. Also, check out our friends at Sentry, sentry.io/changelog. Use our coupon code to get 6 months of the team plan for free. That's so awesome. 6 months free. Use the code changelogmedia. Again, sentry.io. That's SENTRY.io.
So on August 16th, 1993, 30 years ago to the day, Ian Murdoch first announced the Debian Project to the world. And today we are joined by the current Debian Project Lead, Jonathan Carter. Thanks for coming on the show, Jonathan.
Thank you for having me.
30 years is a long time. That's like 3/4 of my life. I'm wondering how old you are, Jonathan. How much of your life is that?
That's about 3/4 of my life. Okay. I was 11 years old when Debian was released, so I'm 41 years old now.
Okay.
Back then, I did not know Debian existed even. I was using Windows 3.1 on MS-DOS 6 back then on my little Thread 6. It was very exciting times.
Yeah.
At the library once, I found a book on X386 and started reading through that. I was thoroughly confused because I had no idea what this was talking about. But that was my experience of Linux back then.
Well, here you are today, and the current project lead, if you go to the website or the Wikipedia list of Debian project leaders, I counted them up. I think you might be the 18th. And so a long line of people that have taken on this role that you currently hold. Maybe tell us about what it means to be the project lead and how you got to that position with this community.
Wow, that's a long story. But we have time, right? Mm-hmm. We have an hour as far as I know. I'll try not to fill the whole hour with this. My first time that I've tried Linux was in 1999. I installed Red Hat Linux that I got from a CD. I can't remember where it was. It was on a magazine or something like that. And I was thoroughly disappointed at it. I said it was trash. I'm not going to waste any more time on this. Then I started working at a computer shop and fixed PCs the whole day long. It was also horrible. Mostly removing viruses from Windows machines, fixing all kinds of Windows issues. I did not enjoy it. And I said, I'm done with computers. I will find another career. I'll figure something out, even if it means I have to paint or do tiling or I don't know anything else about computers. Then I happened to come across Red Hat 7.2, and it was just a complete different experience than my first experience with Red Hat Linux version 6. Suddenly my modem worked, my display worked, all of these things that was impossible to get working on my computer just suddenly work. And I thought, wow, if free software could make this big of an improvement in just a span of 2 years, what's going to happen over the next 5 or 10 or 20 years? And I started getting interested in it and learned how to set up basic things like DHCP server and web server and all the typical common use things you'll do with a Linux server back then. And I thought, well, this is great. Maybe I can learn kids how to do this so that when they leave school and they couldn't go to university or did they want to start working in IT somehow, they can start a career on Linux and they'll have a good basis. And at that point, I messaged the local Linux user group about this. And I got in touch with the Shuttleworth Foundation. That's a local nonprofit funded by Mark Shuttleworth. And they wanted to start a project to get Linux into schools, not specifically to get kids leveled up on technical skills, but mostly just as a kind of a pilot to show that you can run Linux on desktop in schools and kids can do all their learning on there. So I started volunteering for them, where we had a big volunteer group where we went to schools on Saturdays and we installed a lab from scratch in one day. And we ended up installing 200 of these computer labs. So we would take a bunch of old donated computers from companies and install an LTSP server and set up a thin client lab for the school. So that was very exciting. And I ended up doing contract work for Shuttleworth Foundation, ended up working there full time. And that's how my career in free software and open source started. And from there, I became an Ubuntu contributor, and a very long and winding tale. I ended up working in Canada for about 3 years, working on Linux deployments in the US, in school districts there. Came back here, working for a university now, and doing open source and free software since for the last 20 years or so. And been thoroughly enjoying it. It's fantastic.
So from Ubuntu to Debian project lead, close that loop for us in terms of, this is like a thing that you're elected for. Certainly you got involved with Debian and grew into this somehow, right?
Yeah. Ubuntu is so complex and the community has changed so much. At some point, I wasn't happy with some choices that Canonical made, and it was just so top down and the community didn't get much of a choice. And the more I read about Debian and how it works, that it's not controlled by any one company, that it's more like a democracy, but also not quite. It's difficult to explain. But people with technical skills come together, and the people who actually do the work get to make the decisions, and it works. Debian just keeps getting better and better at it. There's like a definite arrow of improvement if you look at Debian over time. And this is because technical people get to make the decisions, not the salespeople, not Bean Count who wants to squeeze more money out of this quarter. It's really a project by the users for its users. And I got attracted to that and firstly switched over to using Debian and then switched to Debian at work and gradually started contributing more. We organized the conference for Debian in Cape Town in 2016. That was a lot of work and lots of fun. And in 2017, I became a Debian developer. So I'm actually quite a young Debian developer for being a Debian project leader. But yeah, I started maintaining packages and getting more involved. And I saw some things I wanted to change in Debian. So I made a platform. That's what you do when it's election time. And explain what you'd like to do if you become Debian project leader. The first time I didn't win, someone else beated me, but then on the second try became Debian project leader, and that was a little bit more than 3 years ago.
Okay. So you mentioned the organization, some of the simplicity, the structure, the way it works. To me, that is kind of the most interesting part about Debian, because as far as a Linux distribution, it's kind of boring insofar as it's like not going to have the latest stuff unless you're on SID. That's the experimental, right? The unstable. But if you're on like mainline Debian, it releases very infrequently, right? Like the major releases are infrequent. 11 so far over the course of the 30 years. The brand new stuff isn't going to be in there. But this is great because it comes with stability, it comes with reliability, and somewhat just this tried and true boring thing. But when you look at Debian as this group of people around the world and this history, it's now suddenly kind of an interesting thing. It's different. It's amazing that it works. I mean, it's kind of somewhat the ideal of what we think of like a open source governance, large collection of people working together, right?
Yeah, I'm still amazed and surprised that it does work. If you imagine, I mean, Ian Murdoch was 20 years old when he came up with this manifesto of what Debian should be. If he came out and said that today and Debian didn't exist, people would really just dismiss him and say, this is not possible. This is much more difficult than you think. Don't waste your time on it. You're not going to do that because it takes a huge amount of effort to create not only a distribution that anyone can do, but to create something that has stable releases of security updates and all of the kind of enterprisey things that we do for free as well. It would seem impossible. And if we didn't do it, I'm not sure if anyone would think that it's even possible. And yeah, it's a social project and a social experiment. And we're not sure where. I often ask myself, what will Debian look like in 20 years? Will it still exist in 20 years? What's the potential paths of failure that could exist, that could cause it to crash and burn, and what can we do to avoid that? And it's a bit like flying in the dark at times because there's no playbook for this kind of thing. For many commercial companies, there's lots of rules and best practices. For peer nonprofit communities, there are, for charities, but for a project like Debian, it's so unique that we have to kind of figure it out as we go.
Mm. So in the detailed history, which this is very cool, there is like an entire darn near book written by you all about the history of the Debian project and all the releases and how it got started. And it says that when it began, Debian was the only distribution that was open for every developer and user to contribute their work. It remains the most significant distributor of Linux that is not a commercial entity. It is the only large project with a constitution, a social contract, and policy documents to organize the project. So I think when you ask about like how something doesn't crash and burn, usually you start thinking, I mean, I just go to like money. Well, like people need to eat food and do stuff. And so commercialization is like sustainability to a certain extent. And if you go look at the list of users, now these are just self-reporting organizations. It's not like you have telemetry on Debian installations, like probably not. But these are people who've come to the website and signed up and said, hey, we use Debian. And you go to that page and there's thousands of governments, there's nonprofits, there's commercial organizations who have listed themselves as Debian users. So much money, so much value, so many people building on top of this thing. How does it continue to run on the backs of volunteers?
I'll have to think about that one for you.
Okay, we'll come back to it.
You don't want to jinx it, Jared.
Right?
No, I think what makes it work is so many companies see the value of their employees contributing to Debian. So people get to contribute to Debian as part of their day job. When I go to Debian, there are many people who are literally rich. Like they have lots of money and they do this just because it's their passion. And they don't even have a day job. They just work on Debian all day long because they don't have to do anything else. And they actually just completely love this. Then there's lots of people who are students who can have lots of time to contribute to Debian. Their bills are paid, they don't work yet, they don't have to pay rent yet, but they do have some time to contribute. But then there is this very large amount of people that are professionals, they have day jobs, but either their employee wants them to do some work towards Debian as part of the day job, or it's a company that gives them 20% time off to go work on other stuff that might benefit the company even indirectly. So we have this huge mix of people, and in terms of being able to contribute, well, almost everyone has their own unique story. We do find that it's a bit difficult increasing our diversity in Debian. We want to bring in more women. We want to bring in more non-white people. But we find that the privilege that exists out there really makes that difficult because, if you have children to take care of or, family to take care of on top of your day job, it makes it more difficult for some people to have more free time to contribute to something like free software. And we find that around Africa, for example, it's really difficult to convince someone that they should be contributing to some project for free. So, and we find this a lot easier in Europe and the US than in most of the rest of the world.
Is there a particular initiative y'all have to increase the odds, I suppose, that you mentioned the privilege that's there, like to sort of increase the privilege for those that don't have that, like maybe through grants or maybe there's sponsorship from companies to say, okay, we'll sponsor somebody to be, maybe they are volunteering, but it's more like, hey, can you give me a $10,000 grant so I can, contribute to Debian for 3 or 6 months?
Yeah, up until this year, we did a Google Summer of Code and Outreachy. They tended to be very expensive. We had to pay lots of money per person to do that. And our return has been relatively low. So this hasn't been announced yet anywhere, and I don't have, final details, but we're looking at starting our own outreach program within Debian, and that way we can have a lot of micro grants. So you'll be able to ask for something like $1,000 or $10,000, depending what you need, and submit a project idea or what you want to work on, and then there will be some form of a committee that will decide whose requests get approved, because we get lots of money into Debian. But we're limited in what we can spend it on because we're only allowed to spend money on things that will directly benefit Debian. So we don't give out salaries or anything like that, but we can do outreach. So the idea is that we have all these micro grants that people can apply to, and that will hopefully help a lot of people to contribute more to Debian and solve a bunch of specific problems.
Yeah. What is the business of Debian? How is it formalized currently? I know that in your 2022 DPL platform that you mentioned. So you mentioned you established a platform when you wanted to get elected. That 2022 platform mentioned formalizing Debian, formal registration, things like that sort of, I guess, formalize the organization of Debian. Can you speak to the formalization that Debian currently is and how it takes in money and how it distributes money? Is it a nonprofit? What exactly is Debian as an organization?
Great. So that's still on my to-do list from my platform back then.
Okay.
So how we exist at the moment is it's called an association of volunteers. And that's not even recognized everywhere in the world. So what an association of volunteers is we get together, we have a meeting, we come up with a constitution, and we define what Debian and its contributors is. And some states in the US recognize this, other states don't. Canada, UK, South Africa recognizes that as an organization. Other countries just see it as a non-existing organization because it's not formally registered at some office. But that hasn't been much of an issue for us because, well, in some ways it has, but I'll get to that later. How we work is we have SPI, Software in the Public Interest. It's a nonprofit in the US that was actually initially started as a backing organization for Debian. So this was going to be our Debian organization way back 30 years ago when I didn't know that Debian existed yet. But it's grown so much. There's over 100 free software projects hosted with SPI now. And they've grown into such a successful spin-off of their own that they can't really handle all the edge cases we have in Debian and all the special things that we need from them. They had to cookie cutter their offerings a bit more to be more consistent across all the projects that they host. And while this is actually a good thing, it's not so great for Debian. So when we have legal troubles or things like trademark issues we need to sort out, working through SPI just gets too complicated and long-winded. And for smaller projects, it's fine. For Debian, we've just outgrown it. And we also have Debian France and Debian Switzerland. They are two other organizations that handle Debian money and trademarks. And so we work through these three, what we call trusted organizations, which are formal organizations that we use as fiscal sponsors in Debian.
Interesting. SPI is interesting. So it's software in public interest. Is that what it's called?
Software in the public interest. Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, gotcha. So that's at spi-inc.org, if I got that correctly.
That is correct.
For them.
Yeah,
okay.
They're useful because that means we can accept charitable donations in the US.
Yeah, you need a fiscal sponsor somewhere, especially when you're a global organization, because you can't, to be mostly volunteer ran, I guess in always volunteer ran, you can't expect it to be like registered everywhere. You know, it's just physically impossible to tackle that task. You've got bigger problems like, distributing Debian and whatnot. So
they also handle accounting and a lot of really boring stuff that no volunteer really wants to do. Even though we do have a treasurer team, we're glad that they mostly take care of, the numbers coming in and going out.
So in that same platform that we were just speaking of from 2022, there is a section where you talk about trusted organizations, which you then acronym as TOs, and you speak to relying too much on various TOs and conflicts and verbal agreements and things like that. Like formalizing Debian from an organizational standpoint is one thing, but then also formalizing your relationships is another thing. What's the stability of these relationships you have, the verbal agreements and the handshakes and the TOs that you've got in place currently? What's the stability of that?
So that's a weak point that I want to address, and it's why it's part of my platform. So this is a bit of Debian internals that I'm getting into now, but to give you some vague idea, or some idea at least, at one DebConf, which is our annual Debian conference, some handshake agreement was made between a Debian developer and someone at SPI that when we get donations, we won't pay the 5% admin fee when we get in donations for DebConf, because these numbers get really huge. So 5% of all these funds end up to a lot of money for just administering, a bank transfer, essentially. But at the same time, someone else had a handshake agreement of SPI saying that, no, we definitely should pay the 5% on those because it helps grow SPI and makes it more sustainable. And this caused huge tension in our DebConf treasurer team because there was this disagreement. This is just one example, but I want to formalize our relationship between Debian and our TOs. But it turns out we can't even properly do this until Debian is registered as its own organization, because between who do you actually make this agreement if Debian isn't recognized in some of these areas where we actually want agreements like this? So it's one of these niggly admin things that we have to take care of in Debian. We're all technical people. We want to take on technical challenges, but we have all these organizational challenges that we also have to take care of in order to make Debian work.
Are these things that the Linux Foundation, I mean, obviously Debian is Linux, so I mean, is this something that the Linux Foundation themselves can provide? I know they have a ton of attorneys that are involved, and that sounds like an attorney challenge. Really, attorneys tend to do business or corporation, legal agreements, obviously, registration in certain places, or at least assist in that advice. Is that an opportunity for you all to leverage?
Not really. I reached out to them and other organizations like the Software Conservancy and Free Software Foundation Europe, and they're all interested in becoming another TO for Debian, but that still doesn't solve our original problem that we can't actually set up an agreement with them. So I'm very open to the idea of having many more TOs for Debian in different countries around the world. But I'd like to have that infrastructure in place so that we can define what the requirements is for a TO. So far, it's just happened organically. And it would be nice to say, this is what we expect from a TO. Here's a contract that we can sign, and then you can keep money or accept donations for Debian. And I just want to formalize that completely because I think it can become a real problem going forward. We had one TO that basically closed down, and we don't know what happened to the money. It was a German trusted organization, and they held some money for Debian. I don't think it was a huge amount of money, but there's nothing we can do about it. We had no contract with this organization, nothing on paper, and that's a risk for everywhere we hold money at the moment, I think. And it would be good to solidify that in a way that, we know these trademarks that we hold of these organizations and these money and the domain names, they all belong to Debian and it's on a public record.
Yeah.
Well, if we look at Debian, step back and talk about what makes it so special, and obviously the volunteer run aspect of it and the democratic aspect of it is one of the things. And even though myself over here is saying like, how could it continue without commercialization? But it's like the proof's in the pudding. We're here. It's 30 years later. Like Debian is still around and thriving, and it's still a community that's continuing to release. I misspoke. It's not 11 releases. I did notice the number 12 Bookworm came out here recently.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite things back in the early days of Debian, because I was in and around 3, 4, 5, like that was my really running a lot of Linux servers time frame for me, was just the naming of the major releases, all using the Toy Story theme. I always love that. Bookworm, I'm not sure. What's Bookworm all about? Is that, have you moved beyond Toy Story at this point? Right out of proper nouns?
Bookworm is a Toy Story character.
Oh, okay.
So
maybe it's like Toy Story 4 or something. Something I haven't seen yet.
I think it was actually earlier. Yeah, I've only seen Toy Story 4 recently. But yeah, they keep making movies, so hopefully by the time we run out of Toy Story characters, there will be more.
So they make their movies.
Forky, which is...
Oh yeah, Forky is a good one.
Yeah, Forky is Debian 14. So 13 will be Trixie, 14 will be Forky. Forky was from Toy Story 4.
Yes, Forky was...
It's like a discarded plastic fork that someone made into a toy.
Right. Is it the spoon fork? Isn't like it's a spork, isn't it? Or was it just a regular fork?
Yeah. I think it's a spork.
I was in and around like the Wheezy, Jesse era of Debian. I remember, of course, Sid. So Sid is, for those who are uninitiated, that's the experimental, dangerous branch of Debian. This is like if you want to go on unstable. Sid, I think you guys backgrounded in that. It's like something in development. What's it stand for, Jonathan?
Exactly. And Sid was, of course, also the unstable kid in Toy Story that used to torture the toys.
Yeah, exactly. Like the perfect name.
Yeah, that was great. What I couldn't connect, though, was that Debian was released in 1993. Now, I don't know the history from 93 to 95, but Toy Story 1 was released November 22nd, 1995. So there's like a 2-year gap there that I'm not really sure where the names came from. Like, what was the Debian 1? Like, what was the earliest days of Debian before Toy Story was a thing?
I think Debian 1 only happened in late 1994, and then it didn't have a release name yet.
Okay.
But also, Debian's history with Toy Story comes from before the movie was released, because His parents worked at Pixar at the time. So Debian was actually used for the rendering of Toy Story. And for a while, the Debian lists were even hosted at the Pixar domain. So it was debiandeval at pixar.com for a little while until Debian got its own domain. So,
wow.
So Debian and Pixar goes together for a long time. And it's interesting because Next and Pixar also went hand in hand for a long time. So, Steve Jobs once said, if it wasn't for Pixar, there wouldn't have been Next.
Right.
So you have this Apple history going back to the end of Debian history, and without Pixar, the world would have looked very different right now.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I looked up Bookworm. He is a minor antagonist in Toy Story 3, a green worm with glasses and a sturdy flashlight, a genius who loves reading books. That particular character did slip my mind. I don't remember Toy Story 3 very well. It's the one that I guess falls through the cracks for me. I don't remember Bookworm, but fair enough. You guys did your homework, and I'm excited about Forky. That's going to be a good name.
Yeah. And Forky is relevant with all the forks happening right now. So, there's always forks in free software and controversial forks as well. So
yeah,
we'll see if there's any fun forks around Forky when that's released.
When will Gabby get a release name? That's what I'm curious about. Gabby? Who's that? Gabby is in Toy Story 4, and she is the doll that I'm going to spoil plots here for people who may have not watched it.
Don't do it, man.
Antagonist character for a bit there. She's a bad doll for a bit until she was good. It's like perspective with every character you find. Like, you don't like them for a while until you realize why they're the way they are, and then you love them and you cheer for them. So that's Gabby. Gabby is the doll.
I wish they could have taken that name while I was DPL, because my one dog's name is Gabby, so that would have been perfect.
Oh, that'd been nice. Gabby.
What's up, friends? I'm here with Jeremy Tanner, DevRel at Tailscale, and I've been using Tailscale for the past, the last year, and I consider it critical home lab infrastructure for me. As you may know, I'm a home labber, so that means I take pride in a solid home network, Wi-Fi, services that make the home run, Home Assistant for automation, lighting, and of course, I run Pi-hole to block ads at the network level and to protect my family from ad tracking. And Pi-hole has this web UI that you can access from the LAN, but for a while there, I just didn't have access to this service or other services like Portainer or just anything else that had a web UI or something I would access via IP on the local area network. But Jeremy, tell me about a world where via Tailscale, you can access Pi-hole, Portainer, or any of these other services you might run in your home lab and access it externally from the local area network.
Yeah, you hit it when you said anything and from anywhere. And so Pi-hole being a DNS black hole, if you notice the difference between the comfy experience that you had at home and when you were out of your house, whether it was for work, a coffee shop, or even on your mobile devices, the being able to set up Tailscale on your mobile device and have access to the same Pi-hole and filtering rules that you do at home, wherever you have an internet connection is a thing. Same thing when talking about streaming. Instead of exposing your network storage to the internet and getting that ransomware, keeping that on your private network, but extending the private network to any device that can run the client. And so having anything that can run the client includes your Steam Deck. That's just a Linux box with the controllers grafted onto the sides of it. And so if you're somewhere that has internet connection and wants to watch some of your video, plug it up to a large TV, and if you're in a hotel room, use that as your media center that's playing the shows that you're trying to catch up on from home instead of whatever hotel TV has on it. Instead of buying a service or paying a small monthly subscription, you have compute and storage at home. It's just an easy way to get back to those instead of usually inventing a bunch of things that you'd love to do, but those sorts of things become accessible to you on your phone while you're outside the house instead of something that's neat to use, but then you miss while you're away.
Yeah, for sure. I run Plex, so I'm in big agreement with that, of course. But just being able to do what you can do with Tailscale is so cool. Without having to learn all the VPN things, it's just such an easy tool to use, easy tool to install. on anything really, Linux, Windows, Mac. So easy to use. Big fan of Tailscale. And for my home lab users out there, you can totally use Tailscale 100% for free. You get 3 users, up to 100 devices, which is like way more devices than I think I would ever need to use Tailscale on. The free forever tier is amazing and a great place to start, and especially to use it for your home lab needs alone. Check them out at changelog.com/Tailscale. The free forever tier is waiting for you to try it out. Again, changelog.com/Tailscale. And make sure you tell them your friends at Changelog sent you.
You mentioned the free aspect. And so when I think about what makes Debian special, I think the completely volunteer-led thing is obviously huge. And I think also the free aspect, because this is 100% free and open source software. And we're talking free as in freedom, right? And also free as in beer. But this is like one of the things Debian does is it won't install or it won't pre-package. Maybe you can help me figure out exactly how it works, Jonathan. I remember having to like install certain things after the OS install because they weren't 100% compatible with an open source license. For instance, like an MP3 encoder decoder, MP3 is licensed from some entity, etc. And so Debian wasn't going to prepackage that. You could install it later by adding the right apt sources, but Debian's 100% free. And I think that makes it different, right? As a distro, not unique. There's probably other ones that do that, but different enough that it stands apart.
Well, in terms of freedom, when we talk as free as in free, we call it DFSG free, which stands for Debian Free Software Guidelines. This was a document set up way back. I think it was somewhere 96. I'm not even completely sure. But if you look at the Debian Free Software Guidelines and the open source definition, you'll notice they almost look exactly the same. And that's because when the open source definition was founded, they pretty much copied Debian's free software guides.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, and Debian was fine with this. Debian encouraged this even. So the DFSG even predates the open source definition by a few years. And it's great. And when it comes to device drivers and non-free stuff, we had a change recently in our policy towards that, because how it used to work is if you installed Debian on your laptop a few years ago, for example, your Wi-Fi wouldn't work outside of the box because the Wi-Fi firmware is all non-free and it can't be shipped on our default installation media. But we started to run into problems recently with everything just getting more and more complicated. Like if you run a Debian Live system on some new computers, you would just get a black screen because it needs a display firmware in order to show anything on the display. You can't even show text without initializing the display card with its firmware. And that's a big problem when you want to install something or bootstrap a system. And to make it worse is even the sound audio you need these days, the sound drivers need the non-free firmware in order to start up. So you can't even play a sound, or, for blind users, you can't guide them through an installation through that. So last year we had what we call a general resolution, where the whole project votes on a specific issue. So we had a general resolution to include non-free firmware by default on the Debian installation media, which is a big departure from our previous policy. Mm-hmm. So a few people weren't happy with this, but unfortunately it's just necessary, because the way computers work now, the choice basically comes down to whether we want to be able to install in physical hardware or just be a distribution that installs on a Ubuntu container or a WSL on Windows or Docker in Mac or something like that. But people did feel that, we do need to keep Debian installable on physical hardware, and this is why we decided to make this compromise and include non-free firmware on our installation media by default. And it makes it easy for the users, so I think overall it is a good thing. And while it is a compromise, there's also other projects that we do to kind of counter it. Like, you've probably heard of the RISC-V architecture. It's almost like ARM, but we get completely free implementations of it. So we're investing in that quite a lot and putting in a lot of effort to make Debian run on RISC-V. because this means that if someone does want a completely free system, there is at least completely free hardware available out there to install Debian on. So we're taking a step back in terms of total freeness, but at the same time, we're taking some steps forward in order to fix that as well. I mean, we can't really control what NVIDIA does or what AMD does or Intel.
Right. That's interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah, last time I installed Debian, I recall getting asked to scan the system, I think, if I recall correctly. It was like some sort of request to say there could be non-free software for you to install. I think it was like a system check of sorts. They'll be like, okay, do you have Wi-Fi and other peripherals that might need it? And it's an option to let me install. Is that what you're speaking to? Like just that angst of like, okay, Debian is really the base version is like all free software, but you can opt into the non-free versions of firmware and whatever else might be needed.
Yeah, the installer used to detect that you have a Wi-Fi card that needs firmware or a sound card that needs firmware, and then it would prompt you that if you have a USB disk that contains this, you can insert that now, and
Right.
it will load that firmware to continue to install it. Now that firmware is included on all the installation media by default, so at least it doesn't need to do that anymore. From your perspective, the hardware will just work.
Is this as of version 12 then?
Version 12, yes.
Okay. I was like, because the last one I did install was 11.
12 is quite a leap forward. 12 is we've got great feedback from 12 overall, so I suggest giving it a shot sometime.
What kind of stuff comes out in a Linux distribution? Maybe even step back from that, and for the completely uninitiated, maybe just like the typical Mac developer, like what is a Linux distribution, of which Debian is one? Why isn't it just Linux? What do you have to do in addition? And then from there, you can talk about the ongoing work that goes into it.
Okay, great. So Debian is almost comparable to Wikipedia. You know, Wikipedia wants to build this huge base of articles of all knowledge in the world. Debian does that for free software. So if you just take a Linux kernel and boot it up, you don't get anything much exciting. You get a screen with black text scrolling by, and then nothing much else will happen. But what Debian does is it packages and integrates tens of thousands of pieces of free software out there. Our goal is to eventually package all of the free software that exists. The only problem is that the amount of free software that exists keeps on growing exponentially, and we're always playing catch up. But at the moment in Debian 12, there's 60,000 binary packages. If you just read the descriptions for all of those packages, you could spend a lifetime, probably more, just reading the descriptions. And many of these pieces of software have multiple books written about them. So there's this huge library of free software that exists that you can use to build new things from. And it's exciting, all the different software that exists from, the web perspective. There's lots of programming languages, web servers, database engines. If you use it on a desktop, there's different desktop environment, things that some people might be familiar, like Chrome and Firefox and Thunderbird, and clients for things like Telegram or Signal. And there's all the software that makes it usable for desktop, servers, mobile computers. I even have a little cell phone here this is actually quite a big cell phone. But this is even, if people are listening, they won't be able to see it, but let me show it to you just in case you might find it interesting. Or this is an actual cell phone running Debian. I have to enter the correct bin as well. I don't know if you've seen this. It's a Librem 5.
What's it called?
So this is actually a Librem 5.
Librem 5. I have not seen this.
Yeah. So this is actually a completely open source phone as well. The hardware is all open source.
That's cool.
Yeah, and it runs Debian, and I just upgraded it to Debian 12 a while ago, but it's really a thick phone as well because it has lots of replaceable hardware, and it's meant to be a development platform. But yeah, it's fantastic that you can run Debian on everything from a supercomputer to a cell phone. And that's also why we call it the universal operating system, because it's built out of all these little pieces, and you can adapt and tweak it to so many different use cases. So it's also run on the ISS, the International Space Station. They use it in Mars, on the Mars missions. So it's really a widely used and very useful operating system for many different things.
Mm-hmm.
Literally universal.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's cool.
The universal.
That's pretty cool. I was listening to something recently. Somebody was on Joe Rogan, and they were talking about the monopoly of iOS, that it's like more than, I think it's like 58%. And so the monopoly rules here in the United States, where Jared and I are in the United States, are 50% or more. If you have 50% or more, the government can block you from doing something or force you to break up your company because of the rules of monopoly and society and how that plays out. That's interesting that you all have a Linux desktop, or I guess a mobile version of it, which the same Linux does, the same Debian, right? It's not. Is it a different version of it, different flavor of it?
This is called Mobian. So it's a team within Debian that creates, it's slightly divergent from the same installation media you'd use to use a desktop or a server. But in the future, we'll probably have one installation media that you can use to install your phone as well.
Yeah. Well, the point I was trying to make there is choice. We really do need choice. I'm not sure if I would choose open source hardware and open source software on my phone yet, because it's like such a immature state, and I would love to check out Mobian. But it's an interesting world because we only really have two choices here in the US. I mean, maybe it's the same for worldwide. I haven't gone to Europe or South Africa to buy a phone and, get a phone plan. And so I don't know that experience. But here in the States, like, you basically have a choice of Android or iOS, both backed by, the F and the G in FANG, which is like, has its pros and its cons, obviously.
The A.
The G in
sorry.
FANG.
The A. Yeah, my bad. Thank you.
The A and the G.
The F.
by one
I was
error.
thinking Facebook, but I'm glad you got my back.
The face phone.
It's in the FANG, man. It's in the FANG.
It's in the FANG, man.
You're picking up my breadcrumbs.
It's in a FANG. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, which is okay, I guess, for a while there, because back in 2007, Steve Jobs got up on a stage and proclaimed iPhone, and the world has changed pretty much since then when it comes to mobile intelligence and mobile accessibility to the internet and communication and information. Like, it's just drastically changed. It was akin to the internet being born, the iPhone being born, and what that revolutionized. But we don't really have much of a choice, and we really need the open source choice, which is for the freedom, is for the for the user in most, I guess in almost every case that you can think of. And we don't really have that with iOS and with Android. We don't quite have that. And some will say that I think Android might be, or at least was, open source. I'm not sure the details of the license and the specifics of its being open source or not, but I understand it to be open source-esque, worst case.
Yeah, the core of Android is open source, but all the additional apps that you need to actually make it useful, they're all closed source from Google. So as a whole, it's definitely not open source, but you could take Android and install it on some custom device, but you can't get Google Maps or all the Google account stuff and the things that you actually really, really need to make an Android device useful. So yeah, I'm hoping that Debian on phones work out. There's lots of different reasons why that could be fun. At the moment, this is just a toy, basically, the one I have. I can't really use it for actual serious day-to-day stuff. Also because this specific phone that I have was more of a development phone. Its battery life, it only lasts like 6 or 7 hours at most. Mm-hmm. So it's really not useful as an actual phone. There are newer ones that are being made. There's it's called the Pine Project. They have what they call the Pine phone. And that one is a lot better. It's thinner and it lasts a lot longer. It's faster. So there's a few different projects working on making phones that can run Debian. And it's interesting to see in which direction it will end up going. At least it can receive SMSs. It can make phone calls, do all the usual things you'd expect from at least a dumb phone. Plus it runs a full GNOME desktop environment, so you get all the usual GNOME apps. But yeah, the universality, is that a word, of Debian is quite a big aspect on it. And also that we talked about the licensing and freeness of it a bit earlier as well. The fact that you can access it without needing to have an account anywhere or fill in your email address is really powerful. Also, you can take Debian, build your product on it, and ship it to your customers, and you never have to interact with us. You don't need our permission. We don't need to sign any NDA or contract. You can just do this, and we often have to really reassure companies that you can really do this because they keep asking us to sign documents or ask permission. Is this really okay? Can we really do this? And we're like, yeah, please. You really don't have to ask us. Well,
it's almost too good to be true, Jonathan. And
it's almost too good to be true.
The old saying is, if something, feels too good to be true, it probably isn't true. And so we tend to stop and say, no, seriously, can you sign this? Because, that's almost unheard of.
When you see why.
I almost can't believe it to be the case.
I've almost wondered if I should make some web form where you can enter your company's name and then it just auto-generates a PDF that says this company is authorized to use Debian in their commercial project.
And sign it Forky, like have Forky sign it or somebody.
Just sign it for. That's a good idea. That's a good idea.
Because it could be cheeky and fun rather than like legitimately serious. Let's laser in on that because one of the sponsors of DebConf for this year, 2023, is Proxmox. And I believe one of the products you're talking about, at least I assume, that builds on top of Debian is Proxmox. Like you can install Debian and then install Proxmox on top of Debian if you have one of those weird systems where you just have a challenge of installing Proxmox directly. But Proxmox is built on Debian, and that's been like a big thing for its success too, that it's built on a stable Linux that is, not, I guess BSD kind of gets a bad name to some degree in some circles of Linux because it's not truly Linux. I don't want to get into that fight because I'm not part of that fight. But the point I'm trying to make is that Proxmox could be an example of one of the companies you're mentioning that builds their product on top of it. Now, Proxmox is also open source, so it's an open source product. But the way they commercialize it is through support. So you can go and buy a support license through Proxmox for your hypervisor and move along with your life. But I'm curious, is that one of the examples you're talking about, or is there somebody else?
That's one of the examples, but there's thousands. There's many. Thousands of companies. It's many. I don't know of all of them even, and I've had many of them email me. But once I tell them you can really use Debian, it's fine. Sometimes I sign something for them, I forget about them shortly after, and there's just so many of them. It's amazing how big Linux has grown in the last 20 years or so. Like when I first started using Linux and showed it to my friends, no one knew what it was or that it even existed. Now it's almost a household name. Even if people don't know exactly what it is, they've heard the name. But if you look at how widely it's used, like every television you buy is running Linux these days. If you're using an ebook reader like the Kindle or Kobo, they all run Linux. If you have a DSL or fiber router in your home, that's running Linux. If you have a car, that probably has 5 or 6 Linux systems in these days if it's in Linux. So there's so many Linux computers everywhere that they outnumber all the other devices multiple times. And it's just exploded so much. Even the supercomputers, up until I think 4 years ago, it was 498 out of the 500 top supercomputers ran Linux. And then they switched the last 2 over recently as well. So now it's all 500 of the top supercomputers running Linux. It's just exploded everywhere, and it's become even impossible to avoid.
I'm not that surprised by that, honestly, because I mean, from my perspective, or at least many people's perspective, Windows is not necessarily designed to be a multi-machine or a headless machine operating system. It's meant to be a personal operating system. Mac OS 10 or Mac OS has traditionally been a personal operating system. They've had a server flavor of it, but they're not trying to compete with it. I think probably because they couldn't really compete well with it, whereas Linux has been so free and so flexible in so many ways. And obviously 1993 and Ian Murdoch and all these different things, like with Debian, like that has been the trend of the universal operating system to work on a headless machine, work on HPC, work on a server, work for a web application. Linux is far more flexible than I think Windows or Mac OS was designed to be. So I'm kind of not surprised, but I am definitely cheering with you, but kind of not surprised because Linux has been designed to be what it's accomplished.
Yeah, it's funny because Microsoft used to absolutely hate us. Steve Ballmer even called Linux a cancer at one point, and Apple just ignored us, pretend we don't exist. And in recent years, when Microsoft wanted the users to upgrade to Windows 10, I almost said Debian 10, they basically had to give Windows 10 away for free in order to get people onto it, so that people don't get stuck on these old versions of Windows. And this meant that Windows wasn't this cash cow it usually is, but they did Linux on Azure, and Azure completely skyrocketed. So they made so much money out of Linux that it more than made up for the money they lost for having to give away Windows 10 for free, and they made record profits. So Microsoft learned to embrace Linux, and it worked out for them. And with the release of the Apple M1-based laptop, MacBook, they demoed how well Debian, the ARM64 version of Debian, runs on a virtual machine, on this machine in an Apple keynote. This would have been unheard of a few years ago, or almost unbelievable. So they all find value in this, and there's some integration. I don't know where it's going to go in the future, but at the moment it seems like there's lots of space for coexistence and working together.
You mentioned the M1 machines and this new Apple Silicon direction they've taken. And the one thing, I don't know if they'll ever do it, but the one thing I want them to do is just natively support Linux. I don't care about Windows on a Mac. I really don't. I would love to just like install straight Linux on the machine versus Mac OS, because they have the most amazing hardware, bar none, across the board. They win in almost every category when comparing hardware. Now, I don't always want to choose Mac OS. I do want to keep choosing Mac hardware, though, because I think they have, in most cases, a leg up. But then at the same time, I really enjoy building out my own systems, too. So I like to buy Intel NUCs and tinker and have fun and like swap out my RAM and choose my own SSD. So I kind of don't agree with that all the time. But at the same time, if I could just buy a Mac Mini without the Mac OS, or with it, but then swap out Linux, that would be a dream for me.
Yep, there's lots of work going into that, and there's this one guy doing an amazing amount of work reverse engineering all the Apple stuff to make Linux work on there. And I was a bit concerned at one point that Apple would try to block this, add something to the new M1 designs that it would not boot anything else than macOS. But Apple has actually made a commitment, and it's part of the M1 and the later M2 and M3 designs, that you can boot whatever you want on that CPU. And they basically guarantee this that's a fantastic plus 1 point for Apple in this case. So
I didn't hear that news.
Yeah, so Linux is just going to get better on the M1 and above hardware. So that is some good news, at least for people who like the Apple hardware.
So they're not blocking it, but are they supporting it? You know what I mean? Like, so it's one thing to not block an alternate operating system to be installed, but it's another thing to support it. I would love it if, like, Tim Cook, like, in support of just an open free world, support Linux on that hardware natively. That would be amazing. Like, don't just allow a separate operating system that's not Mac OS. Literally put your hand down and say, I support Linux on Mac hardware. That would be, to me, that's a phenomenal world to live in, I think, for humanity.
Don't hold your breath.
Jared's like, what are you saying, Jared? Go ahead.
I just said, don't hold your breath. Don't hold your breath.
I'm not going to, I can tell you my dreams, can't I?
I know. I got no problem with your dream. I'm just over here thinking like, it's a pipe dream. Yeah, there you go.
I'm holding my breath. I'm not holding my breath. It is a pipe dream. But, what got me into this, this, Jared, because I started to tinker with Linux on old Mac hardware that was Intel. And so when I got to the T2 chip supported, it was still Intel, but it had that T2 chip. Well, Linux is just very challenging. Debian or Ubuntu, you pick your flavor, very challenging to install properly on a Intel-based Mac with a T2 chip. And so as a Mac user, I've got this old hardware. I've got like 3 old Intel Mac Minis sitting over there that don't really have a life necessarily. And I can install Linux on those. I did choose Ubuntu, so forgive me. It is an ancestor, or I guess a derivative, a sibling.
Yeah, it's the same family.
It's based on, but there's some verses,
right?
There
you go.
Exactly. Like that's the super old school one. That's 2003.
That's a really old Mac
I think
Mini.
This was 2006.
It's got a disk drive. Is that a CD-ROM or a DVD drive on that thing?
That is still a DVD drive.
Wow.
Yeah, super drive.
I remember those.
This was my only Mac computer I ever bought.
For those listening, Jonathan held up an old Mac Mini, showed it off, and Jared and I immediately knew what he was showing off there.
And it had an Ubuntu sticker on the corner.
Yeah. This was back when I used Ubuntu. I briefly ran Ubuntu on this Mac Mini in 2006.
How do you feel about Ubuntu? I know you said Canonical, there were issues when you were involved, but as an operating system, maybe in comparison to Debian, because it's more modern in terms of like, it's going to have more newer software on there for you, more maybe usable for a desktop experience. But what do you think about it?
Well, this is something that I liked about Debian 12 as well. For once, at least at release time, we had lots of new software. We had all the latest software at the time of release, which was great because users are fine when things gradually get older, but when you even have outdated stuff by release time, it's not a lot of fun. And also Debian has backports these days. So you can enable the backports repository, and then you can install newer versions of stuff that Debian was not originally released with. So you can still get newer versions of software. It doesn't have to get outdated. So the backports repository is really great for that. And we support Flatpak, and we support snaps just as much as it's supported in Ubuntu. So you can install things from the Flatpak repository or from Canonical's snap server, and also get newer software like that. Ubuntu feels very familiar to me because it also has apt and dpkg. I don't like when they swap out things when you expect to get a deb when you apt install something and it actually swaps it out for a snap in the background. I think most other users don't like that much either.
Yeah.
That is a bit sneaky. They did that initially with the web browsers, and now they do that with more software. But I would want to get a snap if I snap install something, and if I apt install something, I want my Debian package installed. The other problem I have with Ubuntu is, well, they talk a lot about how they're free and open and they want to share, but their binary packages aren't free. Their source packages are. What this means is if you want to build your product on Ubuntu and distribute it, you can't do that without signing a license agreement with Canonical first. Either that, or you have to rebuild all the Ubuntu sources and remove all the Ubuntu branding from the system, which is actually quite a bit of work. So I'm surprised there hasn't been like a CentOS kind of project for Ubuntu in order to allow other people to build their... But I think what people do is they just come to Debian in that case where Ubuntu doesn't work.
Close enough, right?
Exactly.
That's what I do. In regards to Snap, that's how you can check your Snap list, literally with Snap list, and list out the snaps you have installed. So if you've recently installed something with apt or something else, and you feel like maybe you were a snafu, just run Snap list, and you'll see what's installed via Snap on Ubuntu.
Snap food, that's a new word.
I like that one. They snap food me. All right, so that's Ubuntu, Jonathan. Now do Arch. Come on, break it down.
I love Arch. What's not to love? The problem with Arch is, and the reason why we don't all use Arch, is it doesn't have stable releases. So if you want to install it on 5,000 servers or use it in your enterprise or even in your university, it just changes too fast. You don't want your web servers not starting one day because the config file format changed at last night's upgrade or something like that. So Arch is fantastic for what it is. If it wasn't for Debian and I didn't need to support a system professionally, I would probably use Arch as well. I think it's a great system. They're a lot more lax on certain things than we are. So in Debian, for example, when you package something new in Debian, a Debian developer or packager needs to go through all of the source code and document the copyright of literally every file in that upstream source tab or in the Debian copyright file. In Arch, they just look at what the GitHub page says, and if it says it's MIT licensed or GPL, they basically just have a tag that says this is the license of this package. But meanwhile, there's a bunch of files in a package that might be under another license. And I think especially if you want to build your product on these packages, it helps to be able to tell exactly what the license terms are that you're using. So I think as a hobby system, Arch is fantastic, but for more professional stuff, I'd definitely stick with Debian.
Makes sense.
In regards to the state of the enterprise Linux standard, do you have opinions about that? This whole, Red Hat and Rocky and CentOS and
Alma Linux,
all this different stuff. This kind of come down. What's the state of enterprise Linux for you? Open source enterprise Linux standard.
As far as I'm concerned, Debian is the only enterprise Linux that exists.
Good answer.
I was actually thinking of creating a enterprise theme for Debian that you can install. You have to install Debian theme, and it will show Debian Enterprise all over the system. Because what's an enterprise system? The biggest difference between Debian and enterprise systems is that they call themselves Debian Enterprise Systems, and that's an easy enough fix to make.
Yeah.
The long-term support is a lot longer on Red Hat. I mean, you can go up to 10 years with them. But if you delve deep into the issues, the reason why people want 10-year support is they want to install a system and forget about it and have very low maintenance for a very long time. And turns out that it's not really that simple on Red Hat systems. They use these really Frankenstein kernels on those machines. Like they would backport entire stacks from much newer kernels back to the older kernels that they use on the older versions of Red Hat. And you end up having these widely divergent stacks together that wasn't meant to run together the way that they do it. And they come up with all kinds of odd bugs. And if you look at how easy it is to upgrade a Debian system, and you can also get up to 5 years support with Debian with the LTS project, it becomes clear that, at least to us, that, and also the people who use Debian out there, that it's actually better to have good regression testing and upgrades that work well, so that you can have a really easy, really quick upgrade that is almost effortless, than trying to maintain this weird stack of old software and integrating new stuff with it over a period of 10 years. Because there's been lots of cases where this really bit Red Hat hard, like if you've followed stuff like Heartbleed and where they had to upgrade to TLS 1.3, you can't just upgrade OpenSSL. You have to upgrade everything that builds against OpenSSL, and it ends up being a huge mess. And there's more and more of these cases where it really proves that being ahead of the curve in things like that and upgrades really help a lot. Like the people who did really big Debian web installations, they could just enable TLS 1.3 and it was done, instead of this being this big complicated fix.
I like this idea, though.
When I hear folks, though, like this whole snafu with Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and if they can't have that, if they can't have CentOS, they say, okay, well, then I want Rocky. I don't hear them say I want Debian instead. Why do you think you feel that way? And I think that I don't disagree with you, but when the general public says, okay, I can't have a Red Hat compatible Linux or an enterprise Linux that's Red Hat compatible, why are they moving to Rocky or Alma? Because they can't have CentOS instead of Debian.
Well, we have lots of people moving to Debian after the Red Hat saga, but I think for some people it's a case of they've invested, they have all their configuration against Red Hat Linux or CentOS, and they have so much config and software configured against that it would be easier for them, at least, or path of least resistance, to just use Rocky Linux or Alma Linux or one of these others for another 2 or 3 years until they could figure out a longer term strategy on how they want to do things. And maybe they want to see how things evolve in the enterprise Linux space as well. But I think it's mostly to buy themselves some more time.
Is this something y'all are planning to take advantage of in somehow? Like, while you may be, in quotes, enterprise in your eyes or the public's eyes, is this something y'all are planning to take advantage of? Is there a concerted effort inside to take advantage of this mungy standard, I suppose? Not
at all. Unfortunately, our marketing sucks. We're not good at promoting ourselves or marketing.
You're painting a good picture. I love it.
And this has been a concern brought up over the years with Debian, and we're trying some different things, but we're just not good at blowing our own trumpet. I am, because I'm Debian project leader and I'm good at converting people to Debian. A few weeks ago, my one Linux friend told me that Linux is basically dead on a desktop. And I said, well, okay, I believe you. But then the stats came out from Netcraft, or was it someone released the big desktop stats from the user share, and Linux is at an all-time high on desktop. If you look at all the browser stats that come in, it reached 3% for the first time, I think, last month. And that's big news. So Linux is not only not dead on a desktop, it's bigger than it's ever been.
I saw that.
I was going somewhere with this.
Well, you were talking about marketing. I'm curious if you all have... Well, it was more like, is there a concerted effort on the inside to take advantage of this, mushy term of the enterprise, the open source enterprise Linux standard? Like, it's in question now because of the change that Red Hat made with RHEL, and then they're obviously, it's going to be more challenging for Rocky and Alma to be bug for bug compatible with Red Hat Enterprise Linux, because it's just not going to be that way. And there's a chance now to reestablish what it might be to be this open source enterprise Linux standard.
Well, you probably saw that SUSE is doing a hard fork of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And it might be that Alma and Rocky might end up tracking that instead, and that becomes a bigger, I don't want to call it a standard because it's not really a standard. Maybe it could be a de facto standard if all the companies that build their products.
That's how I'm using the term. It's not literally, in quotes, the standard, but it kind of is based on usage.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. A lot of enterprises do use Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and they often use CentOS, or they did before it changed and was acquired by Red Hat and then changed in terms of Stream. And then they would use Rocky in tandem with Red Hat Enterprise Linux in production. One, because they just don't want to pay licenses for every possible machine they ever have, because they don't need to support every single machine, you know? And so that was why CentOS made sense and why Rocky made sense.
So if you look at the actual enterprise software that you'd need Red Hat Linux for, like SAP or Oracle Database Server, these will never support the free variations of that system. If someone rebuilds the sources of Red Hat and say, I want to run SAP on there, for example, they will just simply say, your system is not certified to run this.
Right.
So for certified software, you want the real thing. You want the Red Hat Linux or the Oracle Linux. Then there's another class of software like cPanel and the likes that they actually sell themselves as a product that runs on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. But if you run them on CentOS, they will run just fine as well. And many web hosts across the internet run cPanel, for example, on CentOS and similar systems. So I think those will either move to the SUSE hard fork, or they will start supporting additional systems too. I see cPanel specifically is starting to support Ubuntu now as well. So you can run cPanel on Ubuntu, where previously you could only run it on Red Hat systems. So I think that's something we're going to see more and more of. Some of these big pieces of software that used to just run on Red Hat Linux is going to expand a bit.
No, I think they're going to dilute their overall market share that way through this process. It seems inevitable as these changes continue to lose trust and credibility.
Also, it's instability for your organization if you have to rely on whatever flavor of the day Red Hat clone you have to use.
That's one of the things I loved about Debian as I was using it back when I administered more servers than I do now. Is just like, I wasn't afraid of any of the upgrades or anything. It was always just like, yeah, go ahead, apt-get update or whatever. Debian just worked, and I would upgrade it with impunity because it would never break stuff. And just like I like Postgres for that exact reason, historically, as a database server, as an operating system, like silky smooth and reliable for me is number one. And if I have to go grab some new piece of software that's not prepackaged, sure, I'll go ahead and update my sources and I'll go get it or download it or compile it myself if I have to. But that stable foundation, especially if you're running a business, like the last thing you want to be doing is dealing with these infrastructure changes as the rug gets pulled out from underneath you. When you're trying to like push other areas of your enterprise forward, not manage a crisis, right? Down in your inner workings. So I know that Debian as the free universal system isn't always the choice for enterprises that need certain license and stuff, but for everybody else, I mean, it's kind of a why not proposition in my opinion. I'm
surprised that the likes of cPanel haven't started to support Ubuntu or Debian previously, but I think there's some clout that comes with running on an enterprise Linux system. Yeah. So CentOS even had a lot of clout around it, and I think they kind of surfed on top of that as well. Are there companies or entities that provide enterprise support around Debian, like as you can hire them to in a bind to come in and do stuff for you? Yeah, there's quite a number of them. The biggest one I can think of is called Freaksian, which is not a very enterprising name. No. But they actually managed the LTS project for Debian and the extended LTS project. So if you want to go above 5 years of support for Debian system, you can sign a contract with them and they'll provide the longer term support. So if you have specific packages that you need to keep running, they'll update it and provide security updates for it. But there's for other Debian things, software development, packaging, and also LTS stuff, there's so many companies out there that provide professional support for it.
Well, there's the CYA that many people need in order to make a choice like that, because it's usually just that. It's usually like, well, I don't want to have unmitigated risk. And so how can I somehow hedge against a catastrophe? And the answer to that is some sort of support contract, and there's your enterprise Linux, right?
Unfortunately, we just don't match the global scale of these big companies like Red Hat or Oracle. Like most of these companies, the bigger ones might cover big parts of Europe or big parts of the US, but no one is as global as Red Hat or Oracle. And maybe we'll get there. Maybe some of these companies will grow to that level. It's more of a journey than a destination. And Debian has a steady and slow growth that's been happening over the last 30 years. And I hope that it continues to grow on at least the same trajectory over the next 10 or 20 or 30 years. If it happens faster, that's fine. But if it just keeps on going at the current pace, it will get there eventually. It's just a matter of time.
How long is it that you can continue to run for DPL? Is there a, like similar here in the US, a president can be president twice, 2 terms. Can you do, how many terms can you do as a DPL, for example?
I don't think there's a limit inside of the project, so you could probably go on forever if you have enough stamina. I'm at my end, so this is my last term. That
it seems like 1 or 2 years is what most people are doing.
Right.
1 or 2 years is I think as long as a normal person can hold out.
Just a lot of work, or why?
Is it 1 year at a time, or is it 2 years? What's the when you get elected? Is it one single year?
1 year. 1 term is 1 year. But I want to return to technical stuff. I have so many ideas and so many, relatively small projects, but that has big impact. And next year I want to focus on that. I have so many ideas to make installer stuff better, to make it easier to find the actualizers. One person called our download page an IQ test because just finding the Debian image they want is too difficult.
It is pretty challenging. I can attest to that.
There's still so many low-hanging fruit that, anyone else could do too, but that I have an itch to scratch. I want to make it better, and the DPL role is so time-intensive. There's so much to do. It's kind of mind-blowing. What I do like about the previous DPLs is each previous DPL from the last few years did some work to lower the responsibility of the DPL, which is fantastic, and I'm doing work on that as well. For example, we have a reimbursement system where Debian developers can buy stuff and claim the money back from Debian. And for each one of those reimbursements, it's like 20 or 30 emails. It's just too much paperwork. And we're finally moving to a web-based system now that will take care of that. So at least that's some load that I'm taking off of future DPLs. Yeah, also something that will continue getting better over time. And maybe we won't even have a DPL in the future. Maybe we'll have a small board. This is all stuff that's continuing to evolve, and hopefully we can make it better and easier on everyone.
This position you hold is a fully volunteer position?
Yeah, that's right.
So what's your day job?
At my day job, I work at a university. We use Debian there as well. We do maths and science. We get mathematicians from all over Africa together and get them on PhD level, and all our classes run on Debian, all our servers run on Debian. They do all this AI courses and math and science of Debian, so it's exciting, it's fun.
Yeah, that's cool. Does your full-time job then kind of support the fact that you're the DPL for Debian? Like, do they give you hours? Do they sort of subsidize some of your employment to focus on Debian?
Yeah, we don't have a very formal agreement, but they know I'm working on Debian in work time and even after work time. And when I go to DebConf, I still get my salary for that time. So it's not like I have to take holiday or unpaid time off to go do Debian stuff, which helps a lot. If it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be able to do it.
Very cool. Wow. Cool for that, right? Last term as DPL. Do you think you'll get the organizations? What are some of your items that you plan to make sure you get done before you call it mic drop on DPL?
These 2 things we discussed, that or 2 other things at least, are very high on my list. Getting what we call it, the diversity. I forgot what we want to call it. The outreach delegation. That's what we're calling it. The Debian Outreach Project, where we can give micro grants to people who want to work on specific areas of Debian. That would be one part to finalize and get done. The other one would be to get the formalization of our organizational structure finished and better agreements with our trusted organization and some framework to connect to new trusted organizations, because we have the 3 at the moment, but it would be nice to have even more and in more different regions of the world.
How many TOs do you have throughout the world? Is it hundreds? Small handful? How many TOs are there for you all?
It's SPI in the US, and there's Debian Switzerland and Debian France. So it's just the 3.
That's good.
But we've had more organizations who wanted to come on board, and we just don't have the structure to do that properly. So for small TOs like Debian France and Debian Switzerland, it's easy because they were specifically founded to be TOs for Debian. But there's so many others like the Software Conservancy and Free Software Foundations in Brazil, in Taiwan, in India, and other countries who want to be able to accept donations for Debian and help administer our resources. But we just need that framework in place to be able to do that. So those 2 things I would like to finish.
So if there's somebody listening to this that can support you in that effort, what kind of support could you need from the public, from just those out there who care about Debian and can in some way, shape, or form either make contact for you or help you with a connection or leverage their network? Or what kind of support would you call for from the community?
For that point, unfortunately, something we just have to do. But if someone has lots of legal experience in this area and they'd like to get in touch, I'd be happy to listen to some advice.
Jonathan, before we let you go, I did want to ask about this section in the detailed history. I know you didn't write this document, but chapter 4 of the history of the Debian project, it lists out all of the releases, and it also has important events. And this is a very interesting section because it's like the official history of Debian, and it's mostly a list of people who have passed away, some tragically, many young. Of course, you and I both know, maybe our listener doesn't know, that the project's founder, Ian Murdoch, passed away in 2015, so he's no longer involved. But there's like 12 to 15 list of important events, and these are all Debian contributors who have died. And I thought that was kind of interesting and maybe poignant to an extent, maybe showing how much this project's about the people. But I just wanted to see if you've noticed that, if you've read that, and if you could comment on it.
Yeah, it's tough because we're over 1,000 people, right? And also as DPL, if someone gets cancer, if someone gets divorced, if someone's going through any kind of tough time, they get in touch with you. So you get to know, statistically, out of 1,000 active developers, you're going to get some bad news now and again. And unfortunately, someone does get terminally ill. Unfortunately, sometimes someone passes away, and it's tough on all of us, especially if we've been in a community for a very long time. So yeah, I mean, we work together every day, even though we don't work for the same company. We see each other at Debian events. So you get to know people over a period of many years, and you think of them as family and friends. So the human connection is definitely very strong. So some of us don't even know where the other people in Debian work in the day job. We know this person does this piece of work, and we know what they're interested in and what the technical capabilities are. But for us, we're like a Debian family. It sounds so cheesy. I almost don't want to say it because it sounds so cheesy, but it is true. It's there's a very strong connection between us, and we do care about each other.
That's the sense that I got when I read this. I thought, who puts together a history of their project? You know, a lot of times it's like milestones. This many users, some big deal happened, a big release. And it's like, here's our history. And it's like a listing of people who were Debian contributors who had passed on. And I thought that is interesting. How do you all communicate and collaborate and come together? Like, how does this bond form remotely amongst Debian's 1,000 volunteers?
It's a huge mess because we have so many communication platforms. So we use IRC a lot. We use mailing lists a lot. Lots of other unofficial channels that we use to communicate. Some Debian people use Telegram and Signal a lot these days, although those are not officially sanctioned in the sense that we don't have any. We leave it to them. Whatever they do there is not something that we monitor or actively promote on our website. So we tend to steer people to mailing lists and RSC the most. And we also have a Matrix instance now, which is gaining some traction. Our in-person events is really the thing that really glues us together. Without that, we really struggle. When we had COVID and we had to do everything remotely, initially it actually worked really well because we know each other personally, and it was fun seeing each other on our computer screens, which we oddly never did before COVID. But once COVID started, there are many teams who started video conferencing, and they said, hey, this is great, we should do this more often. And we were very enthusiastic about this. But by 2021, we got this, what they call Zoom fatigue. We got really tired of being at our computers, and productivity over the whole Debian noticeably went down. And once we were able to get back together in person again, things improved drastically. If you look at the Debian 12 release, it had the shortest release cycle of any Debian release before. Typically, we try to release about every 2 years, and sometimes it goes up to 25 or 26 months. This time it was, I think, I don't even have the data with me, but it's something like 18 months after the previous release. So having back the physical events really drove up the enthusiasm again. And we have all kinds of in-person events. There's like birthday parties coming up on the day that this episode is released. There's sprints, which are activities where people get together to fix bugs, all kinds of releases. And the in-person events really make Debian work. I know you want to wrap up, but another thing that was part of my DPL platform was to establish a more formal framework for local groups. So local groups are groups of just Debian users who get together and do Debian stuff. So for example, in Brazil and in other parts of the world, they just have like a big Debian party where they do talks and have cake and drink beer and have all these kinds of Debian events happening. And we want to see how we can support these groups a bit more, either financially or sending them some swag for their events, or helping people get bootstrapped when a new local group is formed. And that's a big part of what I'd like to achieve in this DPL team as well. Make local groups easier, make it easier for people to start off with. I've been wanting to get one off the ground in my country for a long time, and I finally have a few people who's interested in helping out. But there's little documentation and help that I can send them to right now, and hopefully we can get that bootstrapped and fixed for the future.
Well, one thing we did before was we had Zach Latta on a while back talking about Hack Club. It's not hat, H-A-T, if I mispronounced. It's hackclub.com. So I would suggest that you check out that episode.
Yeah.
Because, hey, why not promote our back catalog? But at the same time, just like pay attention to what they're doing, because they did a lot of stuff in person. But Zach talked specifically about like this online presence and like a lot of the things you're talking about that really revived the Debian community, but then also thrived it prior to COVID and, not being able to meet as much in person and whatnot. But like there's just a lot that they've done that keeps the spirit alive, despite not always being able to have that many teen hackers. What do they call themselves, Jared? Hackers?
Probably.
Hack clubbers?
Probably
hack clubbers.
Hackers.
Hack clubbers is what they say online.
Yeah.
So there's some things I think you can check out that they're doing well. And if you want an intro to Zach, I'd be happy to connect you because he's a great dude and has a lot of great ideas and obviously has done well with Hack Club. It's a 501c3. It's a nonprofit organization and it thrives very, very well. So I'd check out what they're doing well when it comes to how you may plan future Debian meetups and localized things.
Especially locally, yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to speak to them. I see on their website they are here in Cape Town as well, so maybe I can check out the local instance of a club locally.
Yeah,
excellent.
Absolutely. Well, very cool.
Yes.
Thank you so much for taking us on this Debian journey, this 30 years. You're
30 years.
This year being your 4th year of service. As you said, your last year of service, and you have some goals that you have in mind for it. Really a big fan of Debian. Thanks so much for just sharing the journey here with us and all your effort to make it what it is today and what it will be tomorrow, technically or organizationally.
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me and helping us share some Debian thoughts with the world out there.
I don't know about you, but I'm a big Debian fan. I'm a big fan of products being able to be built on top of Debian. I think Debian has truly the hallmark of the way to lead a free and open distro of Linux for everyone to use, even the enterprise, as Jonathan shared here in the show today. And like many of you, we join in celebration of 30 years of Debian and hopefully 30 more years or more to come. Again, we have some bonus content for our Plus subscribers, so stick around for that. Changelog.com/plus for those who are not members. Check it out. And by the way, Jared and I will be at the Strange Loop Conference, the last Strange Loop Conference. So if you're going to be there, make sure you say hello. Hit us up on Twitter, hop in our Slack, changelog.com/community. It's free to join. We'd love to see you there. You can learn more at thestrangeloop.com. And yes, a big, massive thank you to our friends and our partners at Fastly, Fly, and also TypeSense. And our Beats Master in Residence, Breakmaster Cylinder. Keep them beats coming. Thank you. Thank you. But that's it. This show's done. We'll see you again on Friday.